A new generation of bison shows us how the reintroduction is not only improving the ecosystem, but also deep cultural connection.
These bison calves are among the first born on the tribal land here.
They've been gone from here for at least a couple hundred years. 150 years, almost 200 years.
When the United States released hundreds of bison into one of the driest, most unforgiving deserts in the West, most people thought they were insane. After all, they hadn't even built any fences or set up any feeders. They had just walked away without even promising to come back. Some called it a slow-motion slaughter. Others dismissed it as a pointless publicity stunt. But a decade later, something happened that no one, not even the scientists, saw coming. This is the story of how hundreds of abandoned bison turned a desert wasteland into something unrecognizable, and why their survival may just rewrite the future of conservation. Releasing the bisons, the beginning. Imagine a dusty convoy rolling into Utah's Henry Mountains, trailers rattling behind trucks as they wind through sagebrush and sandstone. Inside those steel containers stand animals that once ruled the continent, hulking bison, restless and impatient, the kind of creatures that seem like they belong to another age. As the gates swing open, they surge forward in a blur of hooves and muscle, kicking up dust that hangs in the thin desert air. For a few moments, it looks like a scene ripped straight from the Great Plains. But here's the twist. This isn't the open prairie. This is desert country. Dry, rocky, and utterly unforgiving. The release isn't celebrated with fanfare. There are no cheering crowds and no photographers capturing a historic moment. Just a handful of biologists with clipboards in hand, watching in silence as the bison scatter into canyons and ridges. For them, it's an experiment teetering on the edge of madness. There are no fences built to keep the animals corralled, and no feed has been stockpiled to see them through lean winters. No supplementary water sources have been installed either. In essence, the bison have been dropped into a survival test, with nothing to rely on but instinct. To locals, all this feels reckless. Ranchers think it's inhumane since bisons don't belong in a desert. To skeptics, it borders on cruelty, as if the animals were being set up for slow starvation. Yet behind this decision lies more than just blind chance. For scientists, the gamble is calculated. They want to see if nature, stripped of human micromanagement, can still remember how to heal itself. And that's where the story begins, with a release that feels more like abandonment. At first glance, it looks like a failure waiting to happen. But underneath, it plants the seeds of a much bigger question. What if the land knows how to take care of itself, as long as the right players are put back into the game? The ghosts of the prairie resurrected. To understand why anyone would release bison into the wrong habitat, you have to rewind a century and a half, back to a time when the landscape of North America looked radically different. Picture standing on a bluff in the Great Plains in the mid-1800s. The horizon isn't still, it moves, rippling with the dark mass of bison herds, so vast that travelers claimed they stretched farther than the eye could see. 30, maybe 60 million animals shaped those prairies, not by accident, but by design. Every step, every wallow, every dung pad carried ecological consequences. Their hooves broke hardened soil, allowing rain to seep deeper into the ground. Their grazing kept grasses in a perpetual cycle of renewal. Their migrations meant no patch of land was ever stripped bare for long. Bison were not only animals but also ecosystem engineers, creators of balance. And then, almost overnight, the machinery suddenly collapsed. By 1900, fewer than 1,000 bison remained. What had once been an endless sea of life became silence, interrupted only by cattle, which grazed in ways that stripped and exhausted the land. Cattle lingered where bison once roamed. They chewed vegetation to the nub. They compacted soil into lifeless slabs. And without the ancient rhythm of bison herds, vast swaths of the West became brittle, prone to drought and erosion. By the early 2000s, conservationists were haunted by that absence. They understood that restoring landscapes wasn't just about planting grasses or fencing reserves. It required bringing back the keystone species that had once held everything together. But here was the catch. The easy places and the fertile grasslands were already crowded with agriculture, development, and politics. If bison were to return in meaningful numbers, they needed a new canvas. That's when eyes turned to the Henry Mountains, a place not many thought was suitable, yet paradoxically empty enough to stage a bold experiment. Instead of asking where bison fit, ecologists asked, could the land itself be reshaped around them? Could the ghosts of the prairie whisper their way back into a desert most people had written off? Why the mountains felt like the wrong place. If you were tasked with choosing a home for bison, you'd likely skip right past the Henry Mountains. This is not the rolling prairie. It's a mosaic of high desert valleys, jagged ridges, and windswept plateaus. Elevations climb from 6,000 to 11,000 feet, with summers that parch the earth and winters that lock it under snow. The vegetation is sparse: sagebrush, juniper, scattered grasses clinging to poor soils. On paper, it reads more like a survival test than a sanctuary. So why here? Part of the answer is practical. Unlike much of the American West, the Henrys hadn't been chewed to dust by decades of cattle overgrazing. Its soils, though thin, still held the memory of native plants. The land was remote, relatively untouched by development, and large enough to give bison space to roam without constant conflict with human settlements. For scientists, it was a laboratory, an unorthodox stage on which to test whether bison could adapt to extremes outside their historic range. However, not everyone shared the vision. Ranchers eyed the project with suspicion, worried about competition for forage and the possibility of disease transmission to their cattle. Local officials bristled at the idea of introducing hundreds of massive, unpredictable animals into lands already fraught with water scarcity and land use disputes. Even within the scientific community, skepticism was thick. "Bison don't belong here," one ecologist muttered, dismissing the plan as more fantasy than fieldwork. And yet, the decision held. Conservation isn't just about returning species to old strongholds. Sometimes it's about rewriting the boundaries of possibility. By releasing bison into a land so ill-suited to them, scientists weren't just hoping for survival. They were testing resilience itself. Could the most iconic symbol of the plains reinvent itself in a desert? Could nature retool the rules of survival when given the right raw materials? This gamble was certainly a bold one. The trailers rolled in, the gates swung open, and the herd scattered across the Henry Mountains. And almost as soon as they were released, the animals seemed to dissolve into the landscape, leaving several questions behind. The mysterious disappearance of the herd. The first year after the release felt quite anticlimactic. Biologists expected dramatic sightings, herds silhouetted against canyon walls, bison carving visible trails through the sagebrush. But instead, they vanished. Locals joked that the animals had walked off the edge of the map. Tourists hoping for glimpses came back with empty camera rolls. Even researchers with GPS collars struggled to piece together the herd's movements. To everyone's surprise, the data turned out to be extremely confusing. Instead of staying in low valleys where forage was available, the collared bison often trekked into rocky highlands with sparse vegetation, a behavior that seemed counterintuitive. From a human perspective, it looked suicidal. Population counts remained flat, and birth rates were low. At first glance, the herd appeared to be wandering without a strategy, spreading itself thin across the terrain with little to offer. Critics seized on the silence, and ranchers who had warned of failure felt vindicated. Conservation dollars, according to them, were being wasted on an experiment destined to leave carcasses strewn across the desert. Some of the scientists even began to question the wisdom of the release. Was this proof that not every landscape could be repaired? But absence can be deceiving. What seemed like failure to outside eyes was, in many ways, adaptation in progress. Bison were not panicking or starving. They were exploring, testing boundaries, mapping the terrain in ways human observers couldn't anticipate. Their disappearance wasn't the prelude to collapse, but the foundation for survival. On the ground, subtle signs were beginning to appear. trampled crusts of soil that absorbed more rain, wallows that collected stormwater in shallow basins, tiny green shoots pushing through where the land had been bare. The herd's impact was happening not in spectacle, but in whispers, and that whisper would ultimately grow louder. By the time scientists realized what was happening, the desert had already begun to change. The first signs of the change. The first clues were so small and subtle that most people missed them. You'd expect a gradual rise in bison herds thundering across valleys, or an increase in the greenery, but instead of that, it was dirt. Biologists walking transects after seasonal rains noticed that in areas trampled by bison, the ground held moisture longer than before. Where the water once beaded and ran off, now it soaked in, sinking through tiny channels carved by hooves. What looked like simple tracks were, in fact, microengineering projects, opening the soil, inviting life back in. Then came the plants. In barren patches long written off as hopeless, small clusters of grasses and forbs began to appear. Nothing dramatic, nothing headline-worthy, just delicate shoots of green breaking through where there had been only dust. To an untrained eye, it was nothing more than weeds. But ecologists knew better. These were the first stitches in a tapestry of recovery, subtle but unmistakable signs that the land was breathing again. Birders began reporting odd sightings, sparrows, warblers, and even a few species of larks not seen in the Henrys for decades. Their presence wasn't random. With the new plants came insects, and with insects came birds. Each link in the chain was reattaching itself quietly, without fanfare. To ranchers and tourists, the desert still looked the same. Dry valleys, sparse grasses, windswept mesas. But ecologists understood what was slowly unfolding. They knew that nature doesn't return with fireworks. It rather creeps, patiently and persistently. In short, those trickles of water and clusters of plants were whispering that the herd was not failing, it was working. And by year 5, those whispers had grown too loud to ignore. Something was happening that defied early predictions. Instead of fading away, the bisons were laying the groundwork for something bigger, a foundation that would soon transform doubts into undeniable evidence. When the data finally spoke. By the 5th year, the numbers spoke louder than speculation. From an initial release of 250 animals, surveys showed steady increases, 300, then 350, and by year 7, over 400 strong. This wasn't anecdotal optimism. It was something backed by drones, GPS collars, and systematic counts. What skeptics had predicted as a slow collapse was quietly turning into a success story. Even more intriguing was how the bison used the land. Unlike cattle, which often strip a valley bare by lingering, the herd's constant movement left behind a patchwork. Some areas grazed, others resting, each at a different stage of regrowth. At first, the pattern looked random, but biologists realized it was resilience disguised as chaos. By never hammering the same spot twice, the bison created a living mosaic, a landscape that recovered even as it was used. The ripple effects reached beyond the herd itself. Ranchers, once vocal critics, noticed their cattle pastures bordering bison ranges looked healthier than before. Hunters reported elk and deer populations that seemed stronger, with more forage to sustain them through lean seasons. What was once feared as competition was turning out to be synergy. Biologists who had doubted the project began paying closer attention. Skepticism gave way to fascination. The Henry Mountains were not breaking under the weight of bison. They were bending, adapting, and, most importantly, strengthening. And with each passing season, the question became less about survival and more about possibility. If the herd could not only persist but grow in one of the harshest corners of the West, what else might they be capable of? That question lingered in the background, waiting for the decade mark, when the quiet progress of the first years would erupt into something no one could dismiss. What happened after 10 years? A decade after the release, the Henry Mountains looked unmistakably different. At that point, the change was far from subtle. It was dramatic enough to be measured from space. Satellite imagery confirmed what boots on the ground had been hinting at for years. Stretches of land once labeled as semi-barren now showed significant vegetation cover. In some areas, grass density had jumped by more than 40%. enough to alter the very classification of the ecosystem. Seasonal wildflowers, long absent, were returning in bright carpets, painting valleys with colors not seen in living memory. Places that had been monochrome brown for generations now shifted to vibrant greens and yellows each spring. Scientists measuring streams found them holding water longer into the summer. In some basins, pools formed in shallow depressions left behind by bison wallows, accidental wetlands that attracted amphibians and waterfowl. The wildlife census told a story just as striking. Insect populations were climbing steadily, creating a food base for birds that had all but disappeared. Species once considered absent from the region were spotted nesting again. Predators like coyotes and mountain lions seemed more active, drawn by the prey base that had fattened in response to richer vegetation. Piece by piece, the web of life was stitching itself back together. And the herd? Thriving. Over 500 animals roamed the Henrys by year 10, healthy, self-sustaining, independent of human intervention. What critics had predicted as a slow graveyard had instead become a resurrection. Yet even as the success became undeniable, a deeper question loomed. Why had bison flourished in a place where cattle, despite decades of management, had left landscapes brittle and degraded? The answer lay not just in survival, but in behavior, how bison interact with the land differently, and why those differences mattered more than anyone first imagined. Why the U.S. chose bisons? The secret wasn't simply that bison survived, it was how they lived. At first glance, they look like oversized cattle, but ecologically, they might as well be a different species entirely. The way they move, graze, and even rest transforms the landscape in ways cattle never could. Cattle tend to linger, overgrazing a patch of land until it's stripped bare. Bison, by contrast, roam constantly, rarely exhausting one spot before moving on. That difference alone spreads grazing pressure and allows plants time to recover. Their hooves, heavier and sharper than cattle, churn compacted soil, creating seedbeds and channels that absorb rainfall instead of shedding it. Their dung, nutrient-rich and less prone to carrying livestock diseases, fertilizes the ground naturally, feeding insects and microorganisms that anchor soil health. Then there are the wallows, those dusty depressions bison roll in to rid themselves of insects. To the casual observer, they're little more than muddy pits. But ecologists discovered they act like micro-wetlands, trapping rainwater, encouraging plant diversity, and creating small oases for amphibians and insects. Even their uneven grazing patterns play an overlooked role. Leaving some patches tall while cropping others short reduces the risk of wildfires spreading unchecked, creating natural fire breaks. Add these behaviors together and you have a ripple effect. More vegetation means stronger root systems, which means more carbon stored underground. Soils enriched with organic matter retain water longer, building resilience against drought. In short, bison don't just live on the land, they re-engineer it. That's why the Henry Mountains didn't just withstand the herd, they flourished because of it. What had seemed like abandonment turned out to be restoration in its purest form, letting a keystone species do what it evolved to do. And as the land found its rhythm again, people began to notice. Ranchers adjusted their perceptions, scientists reconsidered long-held assumptions, and a wider conversation opened up. If the return of one species could revive the desert, what else might be possible if we gave nature the tools it needed to remember itself? The people who changed their minds. At the beginning, the human side of this story was almost more contentious than the ecological one. Ranchers, in particular, had bristled at the idea of bison sharing their range. They worried about competition for grass, about the spread of diseases like brucellosis, and about the loss of grazing allotments they'd relied on for generations. To them, the release had felt like an intrusion, an experiment done at their expense. But years have a way of shifting perspective. Slowly, the same ranchers who had been most vocal in opposition began noticing things they couldn't ignore. Their pastures, especially those adjacent to bison ranges, looked stronger, richer, more resilient. Grasses seemed to bounce back quicker after dry seasons. Springs held water just a little longer. Their cattle grazed on healthier forage, and in some cases, their own herds fared better. Hunters, too, began to spread the word. Elk and deer populations seemed healthier, larger, stronger, more robust. The ripple effects of the bison were tangible improvements for communities who depended on the land. Now, the experiment was looking more like an asset instead of a risky gamble. This shift wasn't just anecdotal. Cooperative land-sharing programs emerged, where ranchers and conservationists worked together to improve soil health, manage grazing pressure, and share knowledge. Indigenous tribes, who had been leading voices for bison restoration long before it became fashionable, found themselves with new allies. Their cultural and ecological arguments for the animal's return now had living, breathing proof scattered across the desert valleys. The human narrative slowly transformed from conflict to cautious coexistence. The Henry Mountains had been a battleground of competing values. But within a decade, that battleground evolved into something else, a blueprint. And the influence of that blueprint didn't stop at Utah's borders. From experiment to playbook. The Henry Mountains experiment was never meant to be a grand solution. In the beginning, it was more gamble than plan, a way of dealing with surplus bison from Yellowstone without knowing exactly how it would play out. Yet as the years passed, the results radiated far beyond the red rock deserts of Utah. As a result, other states began to take notice as well. Colorado, New Mexico, and even pockets of the Great Plains started exploring similar projects. Conservationists looked at the Henrys and asked, if bison could succeed in such a rugged and unforgiving environment, what other landscapes might they help restore? But if you think the lesson was only about bison, well, it was not. The bigger picture was about the restoration itself. For decades, the prevailing model of conservation had leaned heavily on control, fences, fire suppression, irrigation, pesticides. But the Henry Mountains told a different story. Sometimes the best intervention wasn't more management, but less. Step back, reintroduce the missing players, and let the ecosystem do what it remembers how to do. That philosophy resonated in a world staring down escalating droughts, wildfires, and the unpredictable chaos of climate change. People began to recognize that resilience wasn't always a product of human ingenuity. It could also come from humility. From letting ancient relationships between land and species rekindle on their own terms. The Henry Mountains herd became more than a local curiosity. It became a case study cited in policy debates, restoration conferences, and community meetings. It shifted the conversation from, can we afford this, to, can we afford not to? And in doing so, it reframed the way people thought about ecological recovery. All of it stemmed from an experiment that had once looked like abandonment. What began as a gamble turned into a blueprint, a map, not just for how to save one species, but for how to rethink our relationship with the natural world itself. For generations, people had written off that desert as too far gone. The land was brittle, the vegetation sparse, the water unreliable. But the bison revealed a deeper truth. The desert wasn't dead. It was waiting. Waiting not for new technologies or expensive interventions, but for the return of the species that once kept it alive. Abandonment in this case wasn't neglect. It was a kind of trust. A bet that nature, given the right tools and enough time, could do the work far better than we ever could. And after 10 years, that trust paid off. The desert bloomed again. A herd once considered doomed was thriving, and communities once divided were beginning to rally around a new model of coexistence. When the U.S. set bison loose in the desert, what returned was a rhythm, almost like an old pulse of the land resurfacing. It was proof that even places we call barren can heal when given the right partners. And maybe that's the lesson we need most right now. That in a time of accelerating crises, the path forward doesn't always mean more control. Sometimes it means letting go, trusting nature to remember what we've forgotten, and believing that, if we give it the chance, it will show us the way back. What would you have thought if you had witnessed the early steps of this project? Tell us in the comments below. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.